In Australia, 1 in every 5 people experience chronic pain. In the UK and in Europe, it's 1 in every 6 people. And in America, it's even in larger proportions where it's 1 in every 3 people experience chronic pain. So, as you can see from these sorts of figures, chronic pain is basically at epidemic proportions in our society. It's a very wide-scale human problem. A great many people experience it in our culture. Enormous amounts of money are spent every year on the treatment of chronic pain and also in lost earnings. It costs each of these nations' GDP enormous amounts of money. A very large percentage of GDP is wasted on chronic pain. The Hidden Psychology of Pain is primarily a self-help book. So I've written it in order to help sufferers of chronic pain to undergo a journey in order to radically reduce their pain or eliminate it altogether. This is a fairly different agenda to what most other approaches to chronic pain suggest. Most other approaches to chronic pain are suggesting that the best people can aim for is to learn to accept being in chronic pain. My experience of chronic pain after having it for 18 years and eliminating it by using the kind of ideas that I've presented in this book, the impression that I've wound up with is that learning to accept being in chronic pain for most people is largely unnecessary. When you can actually learn to eliminate the pain or radically reduce it so it ceases to be problematic, I think it's worth going for that as a goal rather than merely learning to accept to be in pain. Unfortunately, most of the messages that we receive in our culture about chronic pain suggest that the best you can aim for is learning to accept being in pain. And to me, that's a bit like teaching people to learn to live on their knees when in fact they can learn to stand again and walk freely. The book itself presents a great deal of information about what does and doesn't cause chronic pain. There are so many misconceptions and myths in our society about what causes chronic pain that essentially we require a new education. We need a re-education about what are the causal factors in chronic pain. The problem is that a lot of the misconceptions and myths that have been promulgated in our society actually feed into the chronic pain and are actually part of the explanation as to why people wind up being in chronic pain and why as a society we have chronic pain in epidemic proportions. So it really is essential that people get a proper understanding of what's going on with chronic pain. All of the information presented in my book is backed up by scientific evidence. The Hidden Psychology of Pain refers to the fact that psychological and social factors are fundamentally important in both causing chronic pain for people and also in the successful treatment of chronic pain for people. The reason why I refer to the psychology as being hidden is for 2 reasons. One reason is that psychology has been largely hidden from the cultural discussion of chronic pain that we've had for the last 50 or so years. Believe it or not, back in the 30s, 40s and 50s, there was a far greater awareness of the role of psychological factors and social factors in the causation of a whole range of different health conditions, including pain, than there's been in the last 50 or so years. The reason for this has been, I think, that in the post-war era, with the boom in technology, medical science has leapt ahead in leaps and bounds in a remarkable way, so that it's now possible to do heart transplants and lung transplants, etc. So the medical science and the technology associated has become so sophisticated that it's just simply become remarkable what can be done to help people these days with physical health issues. However, there's been no similar advances in the medical or technological treatment of chronic pain during this time. However, what it means is that as a culture we've been overly seduced by the technological advances that have gone on in medical science, which has further simply reinforced the biomechanical way of making sense of the human organism. So these days, the human is viewed as being basically just a clever collection of nuts and bolts as some kind of sophisticated machinery. The reality is we're nothing like a sophisticated machine. We're highly sophisticated living organisms, but there's nothing machine-like about us whatsoever. However, this machine analogy has become the main way of making sense of the human being. The problem with that is that it's leaving out an enormous part of the equation of what it means to be a human being. Obviously, we're highly psychological and social beings as well as physical beings. And to the extent that medical science and medical treatment approaches and physical treatment approaches focus purely on the biomechanics of chronic pain, they exclude basically an awareness of the psychological and social factors. And in so doing, they're leaving out an enormous and a very important part of the equation. It's for this reason that I refer to psychology as being hidden. It's been hidden from the cultural discussion of chronic pain. The other way in which psychology is hidden is more on an individual level. We can think of the human psyche as being made up of both the conscious mind, things that we're aware of from any moment-to-moment basis, as well as our unconscious or our subconscious mind. And you can think of the unconscious mind as being like a warehouse or a storehouse, which is a collection place for all of our psychological experiences. Now, this will include primarily the emotional flavour of those experiences. We may not remember what it's like being a 2-year-old having a tantrum, but the emotional flavour of that experience can be stored away in our deep unconscious, along with other events in our lives which have been disturbing or traumatic, as well as positive and pleasant experiences. So our unconscious mind stores away all the experiences that we've had, primarily the emotional flavour of those experiences. Now, the fact that it's unconscious means that it's largely hidden from our conscious awareness. The importance of the unconscious mind is that it appears that emotional, psychological forms of pain and tension, dilemmas, traumas can build up such a level of tension in the unconscious that they threaten to burst into our conscious awareness. And if that was to happen, we may experience an enormous emotional or psychological meltdown or breakdown, as it's sometimes called. So a part of our mind or brain is aware of what's bubbling away in our unconscious and is aware when emotionally threatening material is nearly erupting into our conscious awareness. It wants to prevent that from happening because it's frightened about what the consequences will be for us. And it's able to use a range of biological pathways to produce a very real physical pain in order to detract our attention away from the emotional pain. It's as if our deep unconscious mind is able to think, well, we would rather be in physical pain than in emotional pain. It figures we can more easily cope with physical pain than psychological or emotional pain. Now, all this is happening at an unconscious level, and as a result, it's hidden from our conscious awareness. So the hidden psychology of pain is referring to the psychological aspects of chronic pain, which has been largely hidden from our cultural discussion of chronic pain and the treatment of chronic pain, but also within us as individuals, whereby it's been hidden from our conscious awareness. I'm often amazed at people that have gone through traumatic experiences seem to diminish the importance or the impact of those experiences. The reality is, I think trauma is basically the sea that we're swimming in. It's so prevalent that most of us are rarely aware of the reality of trauma only because it surrounds us. There's an enormous amount of trauma in most individuals and in our culture in varying degrees. Some people are highly traumatised and some people are traumatised to a lesser degree, but I think it's part of the emotional baggage that we all pick up in one way or another. And emotional trauma seems to play a very large role in the causation of chronic pain as well. So my book is helping people to catalogue the experiences in their lives where there may be trauma around those experiences, and also provide self-help strategies to enable people to work with those traumas where they're not of an extreme nature, as well as strategies for learning how to manage anger better, learning how to express it better rather than just simply suppress it. And I also have suggestions in there on how to recognise if the trauma that somebody's suffering from is too large for a self-help approach, and guidance as to when somebody may actually require professional help in terms of receiving adequate psychological assistance, psychotherapy or counselling. People often ask whether I'm suggesting that chronic pain is all in their head. It's an understandable question to ask. I'm a psychologist. We deal with what's going on in people's heads, so it's a reasonable question to ask. And the reality is that a lot of people have felt really quite abused by health practitioners in their past that have suggested to them that they're imagining their pain, or they're making it up, they're malingering, they're seeking a secondary gain, etc. And so understandably people are really highly sensitive to this suggestion that the pain could all be in their head or could all be imaginary. I would suggest that our brain is involved in chronic pain in two ways. And one way is firstly in generating a very real physical pain. So our mind/brain is able to use very real biological pathways in our body to produce a very real physical pain, which will occur in the part of the anatomy that we feel it occurring. And then our brain will also be highly involved in making sense of the nerve messages from that particular part of the body to give us a perception of there being pain. So yes, the brain is highly involved in both the production of chronic pain and also in the perception of chronic pain. However, I'm in no way saying that the pain is simply a purely imaginary thing. I know that the pain is an actual physical experience, and there are very real biological pathways that generate the pain. However, we've got to look behind what's producing the biological pathways. And generally, for most people, there is no adequate physical explanation as to why the brain or the body would be producing biological pathways to generate pain. And if we want to make sense of that, then that's when we need to start discussing psychology. There are very real psychological reasons why our mind/brain can use biological pathways to produce very real physical pain, but there are no physical explanations for that. So if we want to make sense of chronic pain, we basically need to leave the nuts and bolts explanations behind, the purely biomechanical explanations, and we need to introduce into the discussion an awareness of psychological and social factors. By doing that, we're basically incorporating the reality of a whole human being rather than just dealing with part of the human being, just the physical aspect. So the irony is that before the post-war era, when the scientific advances in medical technology were beginning to get underway, medical science and even physical approaches to working with people in pain had a far greater awareness of the psychological factors. This awareness has been largely lost to our culture in the last 50 or so years, and as a result we now have chronic pain in epidemic proportions.